Welcome to JS on Politics. I'm your host, Greg Borowski. They may call them the dog days of August, but not so much in a presidential year. We've got lots happening this week, and here's a look at what's ahead on today's show. A developer with a checkered past has returned as a major political donor at City Hall and in local politics. In the wake of the Sherman Park violence, Milwaukee aldermen have released a plan for combating crime. We'll dig into both those topics and on other City Hall news from this week. Then we'll turn to Hillary Clinton's emails and Donald Trump's effort to woo minority voters. Ron Johnson, Russ Feingold, and Ken Burns. We'll take a look at the state of the U.S. Senate race here in Wisconsin. We'll also give you our winners and losers of the week, and as always, take some viewer questions. Let's get started with our panel. Today we have Dan Bice, our Watchdog columnist, Mary Spicuzza, one of our political reporters, Frank Crivello. Who is he, and why are we concerned about him?
He's used to be a major developer here. In the 1980s, 1990s, he was a young guy, and he built an empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars here, strip malls, grocery stores and stuff, and they ran into some problems, bankruptcies, and he had 3 federal convictions for lying to his lenders, and he kind of disappeared. But in just the last few years, he's come back, and in the last year, he's become a major political player. He has started donating in a big way to local candidates. He's given about $80,000 to candidates for city office and another $56,000 to candidates for state office. And this is, these aren't major races. So for a lot of these candidates, this is huge, huge money. And usually it's not just Frank, but it's members of his family, plus some of his employees and their spouses. And all told, they gave $137,000 in the past year. And frequently they give the same amount, usually the legal limit, and they give all on the same day. So it's like a mini bundling sort of thing that's going on.
So for you guys, from your story this morning, what's raising eyebrows about it? Is it the size of it? Is it the fact that Frank Crivello hasn't been active, at least in contributions, in recent years? Why is this interesting?
Both. It's fair to say. It's such a significant amount of money that, take former Alderman Joe Davis, who was running for mayor, he lost in the primary. It was almost half
You're
of his money.
They gave $36,000 to him. He raised a little over $70,000 total. So
that's a huge, almost half of somebody's total campaign contributions is huge.
Some of these candidates, the limits for aldermen not very high. For instance, one of the candidates, Chris Wyken, who also lost, the maximum $794, and 8 or 9 members of this Crivello team end up giving the maximum to him. So giving one donation of $794 isn't that significant, but when you are able to put together a whole group of people doing it, then it does have an impact.
And I think people start wondering, what does he want?
That's the question. What is his interest? A lot of developers will make contributions, right, because they have business in front of the city council.
But this is significantly different. We quoted Carl Miller, who we all know, who's been around for decades. He's been around probably 40 years in city government. He says he's never seen anything like this because the amounts are just so massive compared to everybody else. And the timing, we also raised some questions about John Chisholm, the district attorney, who had a tough race against Verona Swanigan and a dark money group that was spending a lot of money. And in the final days of the campaign, the Crivello team gave $30,000 to him. And so we wondered, is it good for a prosecutor to be taking money from a prominent felon like the Frank Crivello?
What was Chisholm's response? Basically, he's paid his dues, right? And he's not going to sort of profile him as a felon, and right?
That was sort of his answer. It was also that he was saying that that he wasn't going to criticize someone who has the problems in their past, because to do so would be to disenfranchise voters. So a little bit, it wasn't exactly what I was expecting in terms of his response, but
and Senator Lena Taylor, who got significant amounts of money from Crivello and his associates, spoke very passionately about the need for second chances and how this is what they want people to do. If you make a mistake, come back and give back to the community. I'm sure clearly those checks probably helped, but she also talked about him doing good in the north side of town.
Yeah, well, we should note, on the face of it anyways, there's nothing improper about it, right? Unless all the money came from one of their own money, right? And it's
just mainly that. One big part of it is up until last year, they didn't give anything, and then all of a sudden there's this infusion of cash, and it changes the dynamics with campaigns just in terms of how much money they're putting in. There have been a couple of people, Dennis Troja and William Gardner, who got into some trouble for taking their money and funneling it through employees or through family members to candidates because they wanted to get around the campaign limits. There's no suggestion of that in this case, but that's where it would become improper if someone were doing something like that.
All right, well, let's shift to another piece of news from City Hall this week, and that was, the timing may have been somewhat coincidental, but because they've been working on this plan for a time, but aldermen have released their plan on addressing crime and violence in the city of Milwaukee. What was the reaction, or you handled that story?
Well, at first it was going to be released, and then it was delayed, and then it was released. There were some minor changes to the original plan, but this came from a summer's worth of meetings from the Public Safety Committee that's headed by Bob Donovan and another alderman, Mark Borkowski, are on that committee together. They clearly are more law and order, tough on crime, and that was certainly reflected. It talked about decreasing electronic monitoring, increasing detention and increasing detention times. It talked about boot camps for at-risk youth, hiring like almost 300 more police officers, 150 some more sheriff's deputies. So clearly not exactly what some of the alders have been calling for when they talk about concerns about incarceration rates of African-American men in Wisconsin and Milwaukee.
There were some suggestions it was kind of tone deaf, too, in the wake of the
Right.
violence in Sherman Park in recent weeks.
And this isn't the final plan, right?
Well, it was going to be. It was the
What is
Public Safety Action Plan, and it was going to be a plan, and now it's kind of been walked back. Whereas now they've decided they want to do public hearings on the plan and get public feedback before they move forward. So there's going to be a meeting on the north side of town, a meeting on the south side of town to talk about this plan, and then presumably they want to try to get stuff into the budget for this fall. So if that's the case, they're going to have to move pretty quickly. But it was our understanding that this was going to be a plan that was just going to move forward, not with additional hearings or public input. And I think probably because of some of the content of that, they decided to walk it back.
The president, though, Shante Hamilton, was saying that not everybody endorses every part of the plan, and
There's
it's
only
a list,
5
and you go
alders
down
there.
to the bottom, and maybe it's got fewer amounts of support. So,
Right.
so is
Dwindling
this
guiding
a
support.
useful thing in terms of a cohesive plan, or is it more just what things that could be considered by the council that some proportion support?
I think that this issue is probably going to definitely test the alliance that we've seen between North and South.
That's the most important and interesting thing about it all is this very much looks like a Borkowski-Donovan plan, the conservative Southsiders, and what they would like to see to be done about safety in the community. But you didn't get much of input from the African Americans who represent the North Side, and they've come together to get control and to put Ashanti in as the leader. This is, and we've been saying this for some time, this is the issue where those things might come into some conflict.
Some of the list, and they did shift the order from more support to less support, but the original list, it was very, very heavy. It read almost like a Sheriff David Clark wish list of what he'd like to see happen in Milwaukee.
And where is the mayor on this? Because he's got his own plan. He's obviously can veto anything that they add to the budget and then go back for potential overrides. But is he supportive of some of these things?
He was not standing up at the news conference with them. He released a statement saying that they had been briefed on this plan, but essentially that he was moving forward with this plan that he had before their plan with the Office of Violence Prevention and looking at crime as a public safety issue. So I don't want to say that
a public health issue.
A public health issue, sorry. I don't want to say that he doesn't support any of these pieces, but he certainly was not standing at the podium cheerleading. No, neither one.
All right, let's touch briefly before we move on off of city government on one of the stories this week. You and reporter John Diedrich had the story about the strip club, Silk Exotic, and its battles with the city and the owner having been indicted in a racketeering case. The aldermen were apparently spitting out their teeth, if you believe the quotes. I didn't know Mark Borkowski had dentures, but maybe so. But what happens there now, though? Because this causes potential problems for him to get a club in the future downtown.
It could not. I think the big issue is, will this lead to a conviction? Because if it doesn't lead to a conviction and this indictment stays sealed, which it was unsealed, seems like accidentally, now has been resealed. So he could, if he is, I don't want to say he's a government informant, but if he is cooperating with the government, he could potentially never be charged, or maybe they don't have enough against him. So if he's not convicted, I think it would be very hard for them to yank a license or deny him a license. But if he were to be convicted, I think to then go and try to reapply for a strip club license downtown, if he's part of that company, that's going to be very hard.
He's
They
the
do
one
background checks.
he has this nearly $1 million settlement from the lawsuits over the blocking of his ability to put a club downtown.
Which he just got the check like a month ago, yeah.
All right. Well, let's leave that discussion about City Hall there and turn now to presidential politics with this tape segment looking at the state of the presidential race here in Wisconsin. We're joined now by Craig Gilbert, our Washington bureau chief, who's in town this week doing some reporting for a forthcoming piece in USA Today and across the network and in the Journal Sentinel. So welcome, Craig, and let's talk about the presidential race. So
Sure.
The news this week is more emails from Hillary Clinton, both some that relate to the Clinton Foundation, but also from her server, kind of this drip, drip, drip of emails. What do you make of that, and how problematic is this for her?
So it's a negative for her because it prolongs the story. On the other hand, she's benefited from the fact that most of the focus has been on Donald Trump, including Donald Trump's own sort of controversies and unforced errors. As long as that continues to happen, that will probably minimize the damage. And beyond that, I think it depends on the content of these emails and whether there actually are embarrassing revelations in the emails. Just the fact that there will be more publicity about the email controversy alone, I don't think is deeply damaging to her unless Donald Trump can find a way to exploit it, and he hasn't been able to do that.
Yeah. Do you expect, though, I mean, it lingers, and we'll
It does
hear
linger.
more and more. Is that bad? It's clearly it's not good, but would be if it comes out periodically and everyone's going, that's just another email story, does that
Right.
in a way help her if people feel like we've heard
Well,
that before?
yeah, I mean, I think, again, I don't think it has a dramatic impact. I mean, her numbers are already pretty bad, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we know that. We've discussed it. I mean, both of them have really high negatives. So she's winning this race with high negatives and high negatives on trust. So, so when you think about that, what will it take to push those negatives even higher in a way that's harmful to her?
All right, let's talk about Donald Trump a little bit. One of his pushes in the last few days, and even when he was in Wisconsin a few weeks ago, was African-American voters. He's clearly got room to grow, given how he's polling with them, but is there any likelihood there, do you see, that he will be able to get them to his side with his pitch?
Some people see this more as a kind of indirect play for moderate voters, white moderates, because he's signaling to them by talking about the African-American vote that I'm not as polarizing as you think I am, I care. It's hard to imagine any circumstance under which he gets more than a tiny share of the African-American vote when you consider what Republicans have been getting, and then when you consider how he is playing in particular as a Republican among African-Americans, also among Latino voters. And he's making these appeals not directly to African-American voters, of course, but he's making them in front of white audiences.
Yeah, he didn't come to Milwaukee, for instance. He was in Waukesha
Yeah, he
County.
came
The same
to-
way in Michigan. He was in
Right.
suburban
I mean,
Lansing, not in Detroit.
He not only was not in the city of Milwaukee, he was in the most Republican county in all of Wisconsin. And so that, I think, is not a winning sales pitch to African-American voters.
All right. Now, next week, we have another poll coming out from Marquette to give us another state of the race here in Wisconsin. The last one had a double-digit gap with Trump behind. What kind of margin does he need to put the state in play in these final
Well, he's got to
months?
get down into single digits. Now, the likely voter result, which was 15 and a pretty attention-getting number last time, that number tends to bounce around because it depends not just on shifts in public opinion, but on shifts in enthusiasm and who tells the pollster they're likely or certain to vote. So that number could bounce around. It could go from 15 to 8 without a major shift in public opinion. He needs to get down into single digits, I think, for both registered voters and likely voters. But even that isn't necessarily enough because even if you're trailing by 5 or 6 in every poll, you're trailing in every poll. And it's very rare to see a candidate who's consistently behind in the polling, especially in the summer and fall of an election cycle, come back and win on Election Day. We saw it with Mitt Romney. He closed the gap, but he was never ahead. And he fell back to a 7-point deficit in Wisconsin. That's really, until that he has to really change the polling picture, or the polling picture really has to change for us to think that this race is close to being a toss-up.
All right, and let's go back to the Hillary Clinton side of things for a bit. And at one point, she was going to come to the state with President Obama and visit Green Bay. That was canceled due to news events. Do you think we're going to see her, or is she just basically, she's not advertising in the state? Is it like, I'll see you in Wisconsin if it gets close, or what do you think?
I think we may
happens?
see her once or twice regardless, but we're not going to see a lot of her until the race closes up nationally, because Wisconsin, has been a little bit better for her than the country as a whole. So as long as it's a 7 or 8 or 9 point race nationally, we're probably not going to see her. If the race tightens up, we may see her. And also keep an eye on the television, whether she buys television here or not, whether he buys television here or not. Keep an eye on his travel too. But right now, she doesn't have a huge incentive to come here because she's got a fairly commanding lead, and she's probably got less to worry about in Wisconsin than the majority of battleground states.
All right, well, we'll leave our discussion there for this week. Next week we'll have new poll numbers to chew over, and we'll talk to you then.
Good.
All right, we're back live and joined now by Bill Glauber, one of our political reporters. Let's talk a little bit more about the presidential race. So there's rumblings out there that Hillary Clinton just kind of wants to run out the clock now. We've got about 75 days before the election. Smart move, not so smart move? What do you think, Bill?
It's impossible. The clock is going to keep running, but there's a couple of debates, and anything can happen. So the report of somebody wanting to run out the clock, maybe they want to, but it's not going to be possible to do it.
It sounds like a good strategy in August when, these are the dog days when not a lot's happening with the campaigns. But as soon as Labor Day comes, things kick into gear, and there's a lot of activity and many things that you can't anticipate. So it sounds like a great, a strategy right now, but it's not going to happen, I don't think.
Maybe it refers to the fact she hasn't held a news conference, and given her interview last night with Anderson Cooper, it looks like she's not going to hold a news conference the rest of the way. It's been more than 260 days. I don't see that changing until after the election, if ever.
I took that notion to be that she just wants to limit mistakes, don't do anything too crazy.
Tom Dewey,
because,
I think Tom Dewey wanted to do that back in
Trump,
back in 48.
But at the same time, there's an assumption that the press is just going to sit back and not do anything. And, there was a very good story this week by the Associated Press on Hillary Clinton, and that half of the outsiders who came and visited her when she was at the State Department gave money or pledged money to the Clinton Foundation. And in general, that would be a huge story, and it still might become a bigger story. But, all of the focus is on Donald Trump, so it's not as big a story as it could. But there are going to be additional stories like that, and she's going to have to respond to those.
Let's talk briefly about Donald Trump, who this week it was sort of what is his immigration plan? It keeps shifting and changing and is somewhat contradictory. But
That's the art of the deal.
Team, right? I mean, they want him to be a little more on message. Has he been on message? Has that helped him? What do you guys think?
Well, if calling Hillary Clinton a bigot is being on message, he's on message.
At least he didn't say she was the founder of ISIS this week. But he did this before when Paul Manafort came on board. There were stories, New York Times story says, we have a new Donald Trump, he's going to be focused, and he said, yes, I'm going to be more subdued, going to start reading from the teleprompter. Sean Hannity was praising him for how well he read from his teleprompter, and then boom, it blew up again.
Just so you know, Wisconsin's the center of everything. On the same night that Trump rolled out that speech about trying to reach African Americans while speaking in West Bend, the shift on immigration actually occurred here. At least he sounded it out during a Fox forum at the Pabst Theater that just aired last night. So Wisconsin always at the center of politics.
All right, speaking of our center of politics and things that happen on Twitter, the U.S. Senate race, Ken Burns, Civil War documentarian, well-known person gets engaged. Tell us about what's
the
going
first
on
interesting
here.
thing in this Senate race in some time.
So it was all about education, right?
It was all about higher education, and Ron Johnson appeared at a forum that was sponsored by Wiz Politics about a week ago. It was a number of subjects. He got on the subject of higher education. He was talking about a higher education cartel, was bouncing from subject to subject. And then we talked about, bringing in new tools. And he said, if you want to teach about the Civil War, watch Ken Burns' documentary, The Civil War, and then have teachers proctor the event.
So in lieu of having as many history professors as we have,
someone to talk about it after.
And then that sort of festered around for a while. Burns heard about it, and then he tweeted out, "I'm here to support teachers, not replace them." So he entered the race and then just as quickly exited it.
Yeah. Well, what else is happening in that race? Because that's the key race in Wisconsin, right? I mean, aside from the president, that's our top race. But what's happening?
In terms of the horse race, in that there's not been much change. I mean, Feingold still has a lead, and there's not been much movement by Johnson. In fact, Charlie Sykes, in an interview with Politico this week, said 3 or 4 times in criticizing Trump, said that he expects Ron Johnson to lose. And I expect some pressure to mount as we get closer to the election, again, after Labor Day when things start clicking in. The question's being raised, will Ron Johnson, who is a millionaire, has some money, put $10 million into his campaign account last time? Will he put anything in this time?
And when I asked him about that last week, and he said that the president, he has no plans to do that. There has been a change in that campaign where one of his top advisors, Brad Todd, a national consultant, is out. The Rubio advisors are in, Terry Sullivan and Alex Conant. It'll be interesting to see if they can make headway in this race. It's been static from the beginning, and it really hasn't changed. 31% of voters, according to the Marquette University Law School poll, still don't know enough about Johnson to have an opinion about him.
I think Johnson's been prodding and trying to take different issues and make them issues. Security has been his main, homeland security has been his main focus in trying to gain some ground on Feingold, but it just hasn't happened so far.
Yeah, well, let's talk briefly about the polls having been so static. We have another one coming out next week from the Marquette University Law School. What does Johnson need to see in that one? Any movement will be good movement, but he's got to start closing that gap a little bit, right?
I mean, his big concern is that these outside spending groups don't pull back and withdraw from the race completely. That'll put even more pressure on his campaign to raise money, which it's not done very well to compete with Feingold in the air wars.
All right. Well, let's turn now to our winners and losers of the week. And Bill, we're going to start with you. Let's give us your winner of the week.
Last time I saw Jordy Nelson, he was walking around the golf course at Whistling Straits during the PGA. He's back on the practice field after his injury, his knee injury. So that's good news for Jordy Nelson, good news for Packer fans. He's a winner.
All right.
This wasn't a great week for winners, though. Just
I was going to say, we don't even know what party you belong to, right? Or even
Jordy
votes,
Nelson, he's Kansas.
The Packer party. Yeah.
My winner was Ken Burns. No one was talking about Ken Burns until all of a sudden, bam, Senator Johnson brings him up. He tweets, and then he's all over the place. So that's my winner for this week.
All right. So helps to tweet apparently once in a while in those races. And your loser of the week, Dan?
It's Scott Walker. It's actually a PolitiFact that we wrote about this week. He's been holding listening sessions, about 50 of them around the state. And for someone who talks about transparency a great deal, he's not allowed much transparency in these meetings. There's not been any press allowed to hear.
They're invited guests.
Right, only invited guests. And, the thing is, Scott Walker needs to get his visibility out there and to let people know he's doing things. And as long as he's holding listening sessions with only invited guests, that's not going to happen.
All right. And, Bill, what's your loser of the week?
The Wisconsin Ethics Commission. They had their first big vote, and they voted 4-2 to allow themselves to donate to partisan candidates. And that group, the Ethics Commission, I think probably lost a lot of credibility right off the bat.
That was a picture of Peg Lautenschlager, who's one of the four.
She's the chair, correct?
Yeah, and one of the 4 commissioners who voted to allow them to continue to give donations.
I'm sorry to be so cynical about it, but it's just stunning to me that they would vote that way.
The criticism of that, the ethics or the elections board before,
it's the exact same thing.
It was all partisan
this is a
group
cycle.
And this, and now we shifted away from that. Now we're back to it.
We went from basically prominent and active Republicans and Democrats regulating the system to judges doing it, and now we're back to politicians. In fact, this is a little more. There were some more stricter rules on the former ethics board than not on the elections board, but on the ethics board there were stricter rules than there appear to be now.
This is just. This is an easy vote to take. Really, if you're part of that commission, they may disagree with that, but it's an easy.
But these are politicians who are doing this. Some of the people, David Hallbrooks, both you and I know pretty well. He's been active in politics forever. And to tell him now you can't give money, then that's just not in the DNA, I don't think.
All right, let's shift to our viewer questions now. We've got several here. And we're going to start with one for you, Dan, from Madman, who says, which milk carton is Scott Walker hanging out on? No peep from him after the disturbances, meaning the March thing, and what's he doing on the election? So where, you were just talking about...
I know. I mean, he has been doing listening sessions. He does have an announcement tomorrow. What's the announcement about?
It seems to be an economic announcement with Walker, Abley, and Tom Barrett in Milwaukee. It seems like it's going to be a big announcement.
But, it seems that he's operating on a school schedule right now and that he's taken the summer off. So maybe after Labor Day, he'll get a little more in gear and increase his visibility. He obviously has to do something if he wants to run for a third term, or if he wants people to believe that he's running for a third term, because he can't stay at 38% favorability forever.
All right, and Bill, here's one for you. This is from Jeff, who asks, why does everyone focus on Trump? It's all I read. Hillary's email and favor selling should get more attention. What's the dynamic there? We had others send in a similar question. Why isn't that getting more attention?
Well, I actually think it is starting to get more attention. It's obviously a lot more complicated story than a Trump tweet, and it's can the story be explained in a sentence? And the Republicans are trying to portray it as pay to play. And maybe that will get through. But I think there's been a lot of attention on the Clinton Foundation, and there will continue to be attention on the Clinton Foundation. And there has obviously been a lot of attention on her emails while Secretary of State.
And there will be more stories
about. And they
about
found another 15,000 of them. So yes, there's a lot of attention on Donald Trump, but there's a lot of attention on Hillary Clinton.
And the stuff with Donald Trump, they're talkers. They're easy things that people can relate. When he says something about a woman holding a baby at a press event, everybody knows that, can relate to that and discuss it. But when you're talking about people who visit Hillary Clinton at the State Department and whether they pledge money to the Clinton Foundation, that's as you said, it's a hard story to explain and a hard story for some people to get excited about.
All right, I have a question. I'll throw this one to you, Dan, from Wondering. He says, if Scott Walker had won the nomination, meaning the presidential, do you think he'd be beating Hillary Clinton in the polls?
A lot of people are saying that just about any one of the 17 who ran, any of the other 16 candidates would be ahead of her. I think that Scott Walker showed that he was not ready for the national stage. So it's hard for me to believe that he would be ahead of her right now because, toward the end of his campaign before he withdrew, he was fumbling every week on one issue or another. And I think that sort of stuff would have continued. So first of all, I think it's really hard to imagine, he was the first candidate to drop out. To imagine him getting through the primaries and then into
we can play hypotheticals on our show, Dan.
We can, but I do not think he would be in front.
All right, and I'm going to throw one that came in to you, Dan. This was from a reader who asked, he heard it earlier in the show about the donations from Frank Ravello, and he said we didn't mention if the recipients were Democrats or Republicans.
We did in our story. Almost the vast majority are Democrats.
So it'd be like John Chisholm, Lena Taylor.
There were a few. What do you consider Bob Donovan? He says he's independent. Most people would say he's a Republican. So he gave to a few, but most of this money is to candidates in Milwaukee County. Milwaukee County is dominated by Democrats. I think it's less a partisan thing than a pragmatic thing.
All right, and that's a good point to end our discussion for today. We'll be back next week at the same time with an update on the latest polling numbers and sort of a look at where things will stand as we head into Labor Day weekend, which is often sort of the historic, traditional start of the fall campaign. Thanks for joining us.